go. You gotta turn it, I think.
Yep. Okay.
My great-grandparents had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. Their son, Coburn Wright, lived here in Heinsberg all his life. He owned a wheelwright shop where the Hart Mead Texaco station is now. In fact, he sold them the land that they built their service station on. That burned sometime, I don't know just when, but in the late teens or early 20s. My grandfather built bridges here in the town. The 2 that I know of was one on Turkey Lane over Lewis Creek. And that was there until just a few years ago. He also built one near the town here on Silver Street. He did roofings, metal roofings. He built a barn on Gilman Road, and in 1925 they put on a seamless, or not a stainless, but a seamless roof and steel roof, which is still there today. And I believe the town or some organization like that owns it today. I'm not sure, but Conservation Commission maybe?
I think the land trust holds the easement and Zuckerman's own the building. You're talking about the old,
Bulb farm that Wayne Bisnet owned
Yep.
last, yes. He raised gladioli bulbs on that whole farm. My father spent thousands of hours weeding glad bulbs. I was born here in the village where the elementary school is now. I grew up here till I was 12 years old, where I moved down on the farm on Lewis Creek Road, where I lived until I moved out of town. My grandmother Kate went to Burlington probably at least once a week, and it took her an hour and a half to do the 12 miles when the horse was in good shape. One time she left here, right where we're sitting, here where the elementary school is, on January 27th, 1912. It was 27 below zero. She left in a sleigh, 1 horse, and went to Grassmount in Burlington, which is at the top of Main Street, which is now the Burlington Board of Education building, where she picked up her daughter, Lucy Bell Pierce. They turned around and came back to Heinsberg. They continued on to Stacksboro, where they attended the funeral of my grandmother's aunt. After the funeral, they came back here to Heinsberg. As I said, it was 27 below zero. They were covered with a robe large enough to cover their feet also. They had a oil lamp and the floor of the sleigh, and they had to lift the robe occasionally to give it oxygen to keep it burning. Lucy Bell did most of the driving. She drove with one hand, changing hands often. But despite being a very blustery day, they weren't cold at all. I guess that's most of it.
So you were 13 years old when you went to the Lewis Creek farm?
I was 12 years old when I
12
went to
years
Lewis Creek Farm.
And where did you attend school, John?
I attended school here for the first 5 years. I attended 6th grade in the Hollow School. And then I came back here to the village and attended 7th through 12th. And I graduated here on June 16th, 1953.
Your mother was a school teacher.
My mother was a school teacher, and she taught school in Huntington. In the year of 1922-23 and 23-24. And for spring vacation, she caught a ride in a wagon to Richmond, where she took the railroad to Essex. There she took the trolley to Burlington. In Burlington, she took the stagecoach to Hinesburg. And when she got to the Hinesburg post office, she asked the postmistress, Jenny McKenzie, if there was someone she could hire to take her to her parents' farm, which was the Gaffney farm on Gilman Road. The postmistress told her to go down across the road to the Gaffney sisters and get dried out because she had the stagecoach was full. She'd had to sit out on top and got soaked. Said, you go down to that yellow house across the road and get dried out. In about an hour and a half, a young gentleman will come and pick you up and take you home. And this young gentleman was my father. He took her home, and for the next 2 weeks, he delivered the mail right to the door. He was delivering mail at that time. And he was delivering it with a Morgan horse named Major. And that's how my parents got together.
Now the farm on Lewis Creek Road that presently Gay Regan owns, did the barn burn or collapse? Because you've said your parents had the barn that still exists today built.
The barn burned on August 1st, 1949 by arson. There were several barns that were set on fire. The major one was the Gaffney farm. Both the house and the barn burned. But our barn burned right to the ground. We finished haying on a Wednesday, and the next Monday morning, August 1st, it burned. We cut the lumber, and this was before chainsaws. We cut it with cross-cut saws. We took it to the sawmill and had it sawed, and we built a new barn, and we moved into it on October 23rd, 1949.
You've mentioned previous what we know as Lewis Creek Road at that point didn't exist.
At that point, it was a dead-end road
From both ends.
from both ends. And the towns, as was the practice back then, continued to draw state aid on that road, although it hadn't been used in 70 years. When Marion Welch bought the Esty farm and the Hollis farm, she needed to get back and forth, and she forced the town to construct a new road between the two ends. And that's why it is now Lewis Creek Road.
You had a substantial sugar place on the Pierce farm. Did you actively sugar it every year?
I never did, but my grandfather did, yes. And he also cut his wood and, you know, to burn in stoves. And he had a jack saw. And I've never seen another one since, except in museums. But this jack saw he used to chunk up the logs, and then of course they split them by hand and drew it home with horses, all of which I can remember them doing.
And the jack saw was horse-powered?
No, there was some earlier that was horsepower. This was run by a tractor. When I was old enough, when I was born, they had a tractor.
Describe the house that still exists today. Was it a large, tight house, or did you live in just certain rooms? Because as I remember, it was you and your brother Sid, or did you have other siblings?
I had an older brother, Bill, and us three lived there with my parents, of course. It was a large farmhouse. We had summer bedrooms, which were too cold to sleep in the wintertime, so we had winter bedrooms that had a stovepipe running through it, so it was warmer. And we were fortunate enough to be asked to tour the house when Marion Welch gave the property to the Fish and Game, I believe she gave it to, and they gave it to the Conservation Commission or something like that. Mrs. Regan very graciously let us go through the house, and there was a board that had notches in it like a stairway that you held windows open with. That was there when I was a boy, and they still have it.
You commuted to this school principally school bus, or did you drive your own car at times, or ride with your parents, or
we
milk
rode
truck?
the school bus, and Vic Giro was our bus driver. The first bus driver was Jim Cook, and he had a 1935 International Bluebird school bus that had one seat running on each side. That was the first school bus I ever rode in. But when we lived on the Lewis Creek farm, we had to walk down to Tyler Bridge Road, and Vic Giro picked us up. And on days when the road was slippery, he could not stop and get restarted, so he would slow down and open the door, and we would jump on. Something that you just couldn't do today.
Who were your neighbors, John, when you were young and farming on Lewis Creek Road?
Earl and Florence Place lived at the bottom of the hill. And Leslie Hollis and Mildred Hollis lived the next farm. Lester Millen was the next farm. And Giles and Goldie Place was on the farm where the brick house is. Back in the 40s.
And did Tyler Bridge Road continue all the way through to Linehan's and Moncton?
Yes, it did.
That road has been permanent.
Yes. The interesting thing about the Linehan is George Linehan worked for my great-grandfather on the farm where I lived when he was 12 years old. I worked for George Linehan when I was a teenager. And he told me stories about my great-grandfather that I would have never known if it hadn't been for George Linehan.
Give us a brief story that you remember from your grandfather.
You know, I'm sorry, but I can't think of one right now. But what I know, yes, I do. One comes to me. My great-grandfather was the type of person that went to town every night after supper. And he went to the Clark and Reed store, and the building is still there. Gene and Norma Giro live in that building now. And that was a grocery store. And there was a shed on the right-hand side of the store, which I can remember when I was a kid, it was still there. He would put his horse in that shed and go in and tell stories and solve all the problems of the world, chew tobacco, and drink hard cider. And in the spring, he had to take a team to town with a wagon and clean the manure out of this shed. And every once in a while, he would take a load of hay to town to sell to get money to pay for his tobacco.
Did you transport your own milk to the Heinsberg Creamery?
No. For some reason, our milk always went to the Stacksboro Creamery. And it was picked up by the St. Clair boys. Canned milk, of course.
Who were you familiar and friends with on Route 116?
Our best friends was the Casey boys, Paul and Bob Casey. And we used to ride our horses to their place, or they would ride their horses to our place, and we would wrestle in the hay barn almost every night. I can tell you one interesting story. Back in the 40s, Francis Casey had the first television that I ever saw. And we used to go there Saturday nights and watch wrestling at 10 o'clock. And of course, I had to get up in the morning and do chores, and we worked all day. And then we would go over there on Saturday night and watch wrestling. Well, after wrestling was over at midnight, I got on my horse and was headed home, and I fell asleep, believe it or not, and I fell off. Luckily, my horse was trained good enough, so she stopped, and I got back on and rode the rest of the way home.
Chores in the morning.
To do chores in the morning.
Who farmed on the McEwen farm, or commonly known as the Place property on the old 116?
That was Carroll Place.
Carroll Place.
Peanut, we called him. And that was built by Augustus McEwen, who was the third son of George and Mercy McEwen that I spoke about earlier. And there's some interesting stories about him, and I believe they're in the book, the history book that just came out last summer about the black farmers in Heinsberg. They worked for him. Apparently did very well. When he died, his estate was worth $100,000, they claim, and that was be millions today.